Well, hello everyone. It's David Taylor here, and this is my talk in the Crack Paths conference. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-author Tim Hone, who's a PhD student with me at the moment, who's contributed a lot to the work I'm going to describe. So, in my lab, we do a lot of work on natural materials which are in some way in a load-bearing situation. So we work on the human body, the bones and muscles and cartilage in the body, but we also work on other animals and plants like insects and seashells and bamboo and eggs and all sorts of different materials. And let me just give you a little bit of background to these, because why they're interesting really for a Crack Paths conference is that they are essentially brittle. Pretty much any biological material has a low toughness and a low ratio of toughness to strength, and so it tends to fail by cracking. Some examples from the human body would be cartilage. Arthritis, which I'm suffering from in one of my knees, is nothing more than small damage in the form of cracks in the cartilage of the joint. Excuse me. Bone suffers from stress fractures. The failure of nacre and other materials in seashells has become something of great interest to the materials science community, and as anybody is familiar with, if you try to break a piece of wood, it will tend to split. Some people have hair with split ends, and these are all fracture and cracking problems. Another almost universal characteristic of natural materials is that they're fibrous in nature and that they are multi-scale in their microstructure, and both of these things arise because of the bottom-up construction, where nature starts literally with molecules, which are usually long, thin polymer type molecules, and nature builds up larger structures from these, and so that fibrous nature, high aspect ratio comes in all the way through, and it generally leads to a high degree of anisotropy, as we shall see soon. So why should we study cracking? Well, obviously from the point of view of the human body, there are serious medical problems like arthritis and osteoporosis, which are essentially cracking problems. In industry, the cracking of eggshells is a source of considerable economic loss. People like apples to be crunchy, and that is also essentially a fracture problem. In the field of biomimetics, which has become very active these days, we can learn and design better engineering structures, and a very good example is the development of tough ceramics based on the nacre structure, which I'm not going to talk about here, but I certainly encourage you to look it up if you're interested. There's a lot of very good work done on that. And finally, and this is what mostly drives me, pure scientific curiosity to understand how nature has solved a problem of load bearing and resisting fracture, which is a big engineering concern, right? And the point I want to make in red there is that LEFM, fracture mechanics and damage mechanics generally, are extremely useful in this field, and we really need more scientists who understand those topics in order to make progress. Okay, moving to the next slide then. The main thing I'm going to talk about today is a problem that my PhD student Tim Hone has been looking into, which is the failure of plant stems. If you look around you, you'll see lots of plants and trees, everything from grass to shrubs to large trees, and you can see that they're essentially made from stems of some kind of wood. Now, the mechanical properties and the toughness of wood have been studied a great deal in one particular form, which is when you cut down a tree and you dry out the wood and you make timber for construction purposes. So we know a lot about that, but we don't know very much about the living wood that's found in trees and in other plants. Now, we chose to look at a shrub called fuchsia, which you probably have heard of. It has these pretty flowers, and it's a kind of semi-wood. It's not soft like grass, it's not completely hard like wood, it's semi-lignified. It also happens to grow in my garden, and it grows in the garden of my PhD student. So in the COVID lockdown days, we could carry on doing research without going to the lab, which is very useful. We ended up with, well, so far we've got 2 publications. That first one in the Royal Society Interface Journal is about what I'm going to talk about today, really. Well, no, actually, I'm going to talk about both of them. The second half of my talk will be in the FEMS journal article, both which came out in the last few months. So the test we did for trees and plants, bending is the major loading mode. As you can imagine, if you have a long, thin structure like a stem, a branch of a tree, it's going to bend. It's going to bend due to self-weight, but mainly it's going to bend when the wind blows, and that's when these kind of plants and trees are likely to break. So we took stems, the green things here in the picture, and we loaded them in 3-point bending, and that's the test that we're really trying to understand and predict the results of. But in order to get basic properties for the material, we also tested the stems. We tested them in compression, both axially and transversely, and we also did standard tensile tests, just so we've got all the material properties that we need. So it's interesting that what happens if you take a stem of this fuchsia shrub and you bend it, and you can do this in your hands if you like. If you do a 3-point bend test, there are actually 2 different ways that it will fail. Okay, sometimes on the left it will fail simply by plasticity. So you will get what we call a plastic hinge, where you get compression, plastic yielding, and plastic strain spreads across the whole cross section, and it just bends and bends, and it never really breaks. Okay, you can get this also in some polymer materials. But there's another way that it can fail, which is a cracking type of failure, where it breaks on the top, on the tensile side. Crack runs transversely for a while, and then somewhere around the middle it turns and it runs longitudinally. And so actually the stem has not completely broken, as you can see, because half of it is still unbroken, which is a nice way of preserving at least some of the integrity and the life of this stem. So 2 possible ways of failure. And the interesting thing with this fuchsia is that they occur about equally. So if we take 10 fuchsia stems and we bend them all, about half of them will fail by the plastic hinge, and that's it. That's the green line where it comes up, it yields, you come to a maximum stress, and then you get a gradual decrease in stress as that hinge is just bending and not breaking. Right? About half of them will do that, but the other half will start off the same, but then at some point you get a sudden load drop, and that's that cracking process, the splitting, the longitudinal splitting, and then we've got more or less no load bearing left. So we try to understand why some of them fail one way and some fail the other, and what would be the stress and strain and fracture conditions for those 2 types of failure. Now, these stems are, as we're going to see, they're very interestingly complex in their behavior because of their special mechanical properties. But let's start off with a simple case, which some of you may know already and some of you may not, which is that plastic hinge. Supposing you take a piece of steel or of polymer or something that's going to yield easily and bend and not break. In order to understand that, we use something called plastic bending theory. And that basically goes like this. If you've got a conventional isotropic material, then of course in bending, the stress and the strain are just linearly distributed through the beam. And so it will yield at some bending moment m, which we'll call my, when the stress sigma y at the top and bottom surfaces happens. And at that point it's still linear, right? If you continue to load for any larger bending moments, then you'll get plasticity, and you'll get plastic regions at the top and bottom of the beam, those blue areas, and they will gradually spread into the middle. Okay, so you can work out, and the theory is not particularly difficult, you can work out at what point that spread will be complete and you have a bending moment MP, which is when the plastic hinge forms. And you do that theoretically simply by balancing bending moments above and below the neutral axis. According to the theory, plane sections still remain plane, and you'll get a solution to that, which is just a little bit larger. Depends on the shape of the cross section, but somewhere in the region of 1.5 to 2 times larger. M is what will give you that complete plastic bending. Now that's well-established theory, but let's try now to apply it to our plant stems. And the problem is that the plant material, the woody material, has a very more complicated stress-strain curve. So looking over here on the right, if you do tests in tension and compression, what you find is that in tension, it's pretty close to being a linear, elastic, and then simple fracture at the top. Just behaves like a classic brittle material, right? But if you load it in compression, you get some yielding and no work hardening, so you get a horizontal line. And then at some point, the stress drops again. And what is happening here is you're getting compressive damage. It's actually the collapse of the cellular structure of the plant. And that goes along for quite large strains, pretty much straight. So if you've got a material like this, which has very different tensile and compressive behavior, what's going to happen when you have a bending beam where you've got tension on the top and compression on the bottom? Well, you can see what's going to happen is that the top part is still going to be linear and elastic up until the point where you reach a fracture stress. The bottom part, you're going to start by having compression, the blue stuff, and then as you bend more and more, you'll start to get damage, that red area near the bottom, but you'll still have compressive yielding somewhere here. But you've got to balance the bending moments, top and bottom of the neutral axis. So, of course, what's going to happen is that the neutral axis is going to move up. It's no longer going to be in the center of the beam. Okay, so that's all explained here. Anyway, it's complicated, but not impossible to manipulate the equations and get solutions for that situation. However, there's one more complication that arises, and that comes about because these plant materials are very anisotropic. Like any kind of wood, they're much stronger and stiffer along their lengths, relatively weak and low Young's modulus transversely. So when you bend a beam, and this is something that you may not know, when you bend a beam, the curvature in that bending beam creates a small transverse force, okay? And the force is like that, it's a compressive force, okay? Now this happens in all materials, but it's generally ignored because it's relatively small, and in an isotropic material, it really doesn't play much of a role. The equation for it, if you're interested, is this. You get a dF at a particular height, x, where it involves the curvature and the width, and so there's a relationship there to the sigma there, which is the longitudinal stress. Anyway, suffice it to say, it's possible to work out what this force is and stress, and therefore to work out how that's going to deform, so that when you start off with a circular cross section, you end up with an elliptical one like this as a result of those compressive forces. And that is called ovalization. And you can see it quite easily on something like a plant stem or any anisotropic fibrous material. You can see that when you bend it, you get this very distinct development of an oval shape. And of course, that implies tensile strains and stresses in the other direction, in the horizontal direction here. And so we hypothesized that would cause damage and cracking in the middle of the cross section. Okay, so that's that little red crack here. So you can deal with that by working out how the second moment of area changes when you develop the oval shape. You can calculate these stresses and estimate when they're likely to reach the tensile stress in that transverse direction, which is different, of course, from the longitudinal one. So again, a bit more mathematics, but not impossible to solve those problems either. At that point, we thought, well, is our hypothesis true? So we had a look, and of course, it's difficult to see those little internal cracks because you don't see them on the surface. So we solved that by looking in micro CT scans, and sure enough, when we bent the stem to a certain degree, when we look on the scan, we can see the development of those little internal cracks. So we I think, were the first people to notice that, and it is really the first type of damage or cracking event which occurs during this whole bending process. Okay, so that's that. Then to deal with the maths, here are the solutions. I won't bother showing you all the equations, but suffice it to say it's not too hard to manipulate them. And these are our predictions of the stress strain curve for 3-point bending of these stems. And what I've got here with the 4 lines are kind of introducing these various complications that I talked about. Okay. So the blue line is the solution for an elastic plastic material, which has different tensile and compressive properties. And you get that kind of behavior from the plastic bending on the compression side only, basically, right? If you introduce the idea of getting damage, then it drops down to the red line, because of course you've got less bend and less moment to support on the compressive side. If you add the transverse compression, that's the ovalization effect, then you actually start to get a line which shows the decrease, because out here you've got a very ovalized type of shape, so it's not so good at load bearing anymore, right? So that's that. And then there's a final complication. All of those predictions are made in assuming pure bending, where we've actually got 3-point bending, so we need a little further correction. At that point, we stop doing the maths and we turn to a finite element model just to work out the difference between those two types of loading, and that gives it another small correction down here. So we end up with that yellow line, which you can see behaves pretty much like the experimental lines I showed before, and here's the comparison. So very good. I mean, we had to determine a lot of material properties ourselves, and we didn't really make any more assumptions in order to get that prediction. So we were very pleased with ourselves there. So you can see it predicts the general shape, especially when you get the plastic hinge forming and you don't get the sudden fracture. What about predicting the onset of cracking? Well, of course, we now know all the stresses and strains in this beam in different directions, so we can put in a failure criteria. Different species, incidentally, but different species fail in different ways. So the fuchsia, as we've seen, fails by this change to a longitudinal propagation. We tested another species, which is elder, and that doesn't. It just cracks straight across. Okay, so you can see a very clean flat break here in the 3-point bending rig, this is obviously something to do with the different behavior in the tensile, in the longitudinal and transverse directions. Fracture mechanics would tell you that this crack is going to turn if it's seeing a lower fracture toughness. Well, we know the fracture toughness is lower in this direction, but if you work out the K values, the fracture toughness in the splitting direction has to be about half what it is in the transverse fracture direction, because the K value is reduced by about a half. Okay, it's a bit more complicated than that, as you know, but roughly that. So we think it's to do with the relative anisotropy of toughness in these two different materials. This one is relatively not so anisotropic, and therefore it goes straight across. Another complication I won't go into, but in some stems like the elder, they very definitely have a hard outer shell and a softer material on the inside, which has different properties, and that of course complicates the analysis. Okay. So that's the first one then, and I suppose the idea is that we were able to predict pretty well the whole stress strain curve and the onset of fracture in that material, with all the kind of complications of the material properties. So I want to go on to show an example of what I mentioned before, is biomimetics being one of the advantages of looking at these natural materials, that you might create some engineering structure that's useful. So we went on to develop a self-healing structure which is inspired by plant stems, and this is the work also of Tim Hone, but also of another researcher, Sarah Kellahan, I will acknowledge. So we know that many living materials are capable of repairing themselves, and these kinds of self-healing materials have been implemented in engineering for some decades. Okay, and just to show you an early example of that, I think the materials which have been most well developed have been the self-healing polymers. And so here's an early example where these researchers took a polymer, the yellow stuff, introduced a crack, and then the polymer has two elements in it. There has microcapsules of two different liquids, which when they react together, they form more polymer material. So it's like a two-part adhesive glue, if you like. So when the crack comes along, if it cuts through one of these little ones and also one of these big ones, the two agents mix together and they react and they form new polymer, filling the crack and therefore essentially repairing the crack. So here's the healing agent now in action. So since this work was published in 2001, a lot of different polymer systems have been developed which have some capability of, when they're cracked, they react, make more polymer, and essentially heal themselves. Now, some of these have been inspired by nature, and here's an example of one, which is a fiber composite material which contains long fibers, but it also contains long channels that can contain these liquids, which when they react, they form polymers, and so they're healing agents. And there's an analogy here between the vascular channels, like the blood vessels in your body, or as we'll see, the vascular channels that also occur in plants. So that's Norris et al. A few years ago. So there's a number of biomimetic solutions to the formation of these materials. Our inspiration was to think about plant stems, and especially to think about the fact that the first type of damage is that internal cracking that we see there. And so we thought, can we design a structure that's made from a polymer which fails or begins to fail by internal cracking, which could then be made into a self-healing structure? Okay, and this is what we came up with. So it's a tube with a solid outer shell, lots of holes in it which run lengthways, so they form the vascular channels, and we fill those channels with some with one liquid, some with another, and when the two liquids react together, it's an adhesive, it's a polymer formation. So our idea is that when this is bent and becomes ovalized, then some of the walls between these channels, some of the cell walls, if you like, will fracture and mix these healing agents together and allow for a repair process. Okay, so here's an example after we tested it, just to a relatively small load, just to initiate the damage, and we've got some fractures in cell walls here. We see at different magnifications. So as you can see, if these two channels had the two different agents in, they should be able to mix and react together and repair that break. There's quite a lot to think about in terms of what kind of adhesives you want to use. They have to be liquid, they have to have a stoichiometric reaction, so that equal amounts of liquid mix together to form it. They have to be of a certain viscosity, etc. But anyway, we were able to find an adhesive system that worked for us. And here's an example of it working. Okay, so to take you through this, the ones that are marked control have no healing capacity. They're just the normal polymer structure. We bend it. We're plotting load against displacement in a test to induce ovalization, like would happen in bending. And so we go up. We get a point where the fracture starts, and we get a drop. Okay, that's the grey dashes. If at that point we then unload and load up again, then of course the next one is the solid grey line, is not as good. It comes back to the place where we left off. It goes on a little bit further, and then we get more fracture events as more of those cell walls fail, and the thing goes to pieces, right? Now, then we do the same thing with these self-healing agents added. So now the blue line, which of course initially is the same as the other line, it comes up here. It's more or less the same place. We get more or less the same behavior here, little drop. Then if we unload and reload, we now get the red line, where it comes up with more or less the same stiffness and the same strength here. We get a bit of a break. We get a little bit of drop there, but anyway, it carries on and carries on. Okay, and it's because those healing agents, the fracture that occurred in the first cycle has been repaired. We have to wait a short time between cycles for that to happen, but anyway, it's been repaired. And so now we've got something that goes to much larger displacements before it fails. And if we look, we can see, maybe not too easy to see, but you can see a little blob of that that new polymer material that's formed. And importantly, the channels haven't blocked up. It hasn't reacted so much that it's blocked the channels. So in principle, if we keep feeding liquids down those channels, we can repeat that again and again. If it fractures again, we can repair it again. Okay, so it's not just a once-off effect. And just to show some results there, the black line is what happens if you load this structure just the one time. You get a kind of a shelf, but eventually it bends and bends and breaks. If you have the self-healing and you do a cycle up to here somewhere, and then you do a second cycle, this is what happens on the second cycle, that it's really the same as the first cycle. It actually even gets a little bit better up here, and we think that's because of the effect of the liquid in the channels, but that's not really important for us. What's important here is that it's been able to keep its initial responses extremely well. So that was our idea in terms of a self-healing structure, which is inspired by the idea of plants, the anisotropic and cellular structure of plants, and their repair potentials. Right? So the final thing I'm going to talk about, and it's just a couple of slides, is hair. If you read my abstract for this talk, I did say I was going to talk about hair, and actually I can't, because this work is going on. It's being funded, and the funders are just not completely comfortable for me to talk about it yet. I think we'll get a paper out later in the year, but we just have to hold off on any details. But as you can imagine, hair is rather similar, if you think about it, to the stem of a plant. It's a very long, thin structure. It has a very fibrous behavior, an anisotropy in its structure. It's made out of a material called keratins, which is different, but in terms of its structure and properties, rather similar. And previous researchers have shown that if you take a piece of hair and you break it, then it breaks in several different ways. Sometimes, like our plant stems, it breaks straight across like that by a crack just propagating transversely. Sometimes you get very long splits, and this is when people complain about having split ends in their hair. This is a split end, okay, where it's a longitudinal fracture. Sometimes you get a single crack like that. Sometimes you get multiple cracks, which ends up in a kind of a fibrous end to the break. And sometimes you get a mixture. You get partially transverse and then partially longitudinal. So this is very much like our green stick fracture in the plants, where you get a stepped fracture. So we know all these things happen. Most people's hair is just fine, and it never breaks. It actually needs quite a high stress to break good quality hair. But some people have these problems of hair which is easily damaged, and sometimes that's just natural, but sometimes it's because they use chemical treatments on their hair, like bleaching, or they go in for treatments like curling or straightening the hair, which damages the hair and changes its properties. So there's a lot of interest in trying to understand what it is that causes hair to fail, and the people who are funding us are the ones who sell you all those nice products that stop your hair from failing. So obviously they'd like to know a bit more of the background science. So as I say, I'm not going to talk much at the moment, but just to lead you down the path that we've been going down, a researcher called Swift back in the 1970s had this hypothesis that hair breaks because of tangles. Okay, when you comb your hair, at least if you have reasonably long hair, when you comb it or brush it, you find that the hair is knotted up in a tangle, and you have to push very hard to untangle the hair and straighten it again. And so a tangle is just a kind of a knot. So you have hairs which are crossed, kind of knotted up on each other. And what that it comes down to, of course, is extreme bending. If one hair is knotted over another, then you've got very high bending strains in that loop, right? And so the hypothesis is that's where you get the high strains which are high enough to cause plasticity or fracture or cracking or whatever. And so various experiments were done back in the 70s, where these hair was actually put into electron microscopes, and some of these damage modes were observed. So that's just to give you a hint as the kind of direction I'm going, which is obviously, again, a fracture mechanics direction. So the last slide, I hope I've convinced you that fracture mechanics is a useful tool for studying natural materials. We've seen a couple of examples, but there are lots more that we're working on. And what I didn't tell you is this fracture mechanics is very often used in the literature by people who don't understand it. So I'm afraid we've often come across papers in the literature where people have measured the fracture toughness of materials, and the experiments and the calculations are totally erroneous, and they get very wrong results. So we really need more fracture experts, like the people in this audience, who understand how to do experiments and how to do calculations relating to cracking, to come and help and get a better understanding of natural materials. So that's the end, and I thank you, and hope that you've enjoyed this and the rest of the conference. So thank you very much.